The first time I saw the patrol cars crunching gravel at the edge of our cabin, my chest tightened in disbelief. Blue and red lights bounced across the pines like an invasion, and I knew instantly this wasn't some routine visit. Then I heard Karen's booming voice, shrill and theatrical, carrying over the wind like a siren of entitlement. That woman is trespassing. She's squatting on private HOA land. She was pointing straight at my wife, who stood frozen on our porch with her arms crossed, calm but visibly furious. And in that moment, as uniformed officers started toward her, I felt the shock sink in. Karen had actually sicced the police on us at our own family cabin. The cabin had been ours long before the HOA ever existed, deeded to my wife's grandfather after his service in Korea. It was more than timber and stone. It was a sanctuary, a piece of living history where photos of ancestors hung above the hearth and military medals rested in glass frames. Karen knew this. She had heard us talk about it, seen us bring supplies, even complained about the flags we flew on Memorial Day. But she had decided, in her twisted sense of power, that because the cabin sat on the edge of the neighborhood, it was ripe for HOA control. Tonight, she was determined to prove it by humiliating my wife in front of law enforcement. I watched the lead officer approach, hand near his belt, eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Ma'am, we've had a report that you're trespassing on restricted HOA property. Do you have identification?" Karen stood behind him, smug and grinning, her arms folded across her large frame like she was queen of the county. My wife didn't flinch. She reached into her jacket, pulled out a leather wallet, and unfolded it in one swift motion. The officer leaned in, glanced at the card, and froze. His shoulders stiffened, his jaw tightened, and then he took a small but telling step back. It wasn't just any ID. It was her active-duty military identification card, stamped with her rank, her branch, and a clearance level that outstripped anything this small-town cop had ever seen. My wife, the woman Karen thought she could reduce to trespasser, had spent 2 decades training elite Navy SEAL teams, commanding respect in bases from Norfolk to the Middle East. And the officer knew instantly what that ID meant. Authority, service, honor. Karen's smirk dissolved when the second officer leaned down to whisper something into the first one's ear. Both men glanced her way with expressions that shifted from suspicion to disgust. "This woman isn't trespassing," the lead officer said firmly, handing the ID back with both hands like it was something sacred. "She has every right to be here. And this property," he gestured at the cabin and the land around it, "doesn't belong to the HOA. The deed checks out. We're done here." My wife's eyes never left Karen as she slid the ID back into her pocket. Karen's face turned a shade of blotchy red I hadn't seen before, and for once her booming voice shrank into a stammer. "There must be some mistake," she croaked. "This land our bylaws," but the officer cut her off. "Ma'am, if you persist in making false claims, we'll be filing a report. Wasting police resources is not a game." For the first time, Karen's bravado collapsed. She dropped to her knees right there in the gravel, babbling excuses, trying to spin her story into something less criminal. She even tried to beg my wife for understanding, as though the same woman she had tried to humiliate might now shield her from consequences. But there was no mercy in the eyes of the neighbors who had gathered, watching silently from the roadside. They had endured her bullying, her fines, her constant threats, and tonight they finally saw her exposed as nothing more than a coward. The twist came when one of the officers, a veteran himself, quietly approached my wife after things calmed down. He shook her hand and said, "I served in Fallujah. I recognize that patch. Thank you for your service. You don't deserve this kind of harassment." My wife, usually stoic, allowed the smallest of smiles. In that moment, Karen wasn't just facing the law, she was facing the weight of a community and the respect of those who knew what real service looked like. But this was only the beginning of the storm that would unravel her empire of intimidation. What she didn't know was that I had been documenting her behavior for months, gathering proof of every fake fine she had issued, every threat she had mailed to neighbors, every petty abuse of her so-called authority. Tonight's stunt with the police was the final piece I needed, the undeniable evidence that she was not only abusive but reckless enough to endanger public resources. Tomorrow, I would take it Almy binder, my recordings, and the testimony of the officersto, the county attorney's office. The next morning, The gravel outside the cabin still bore the faint impressions of tire tracks where the police cars had been, like scars on the land itself. My wife brewed coffee with the same calm precision she had shown the night before, but I could see the quiet storm behind her eyes. She had been humiliated in front of the community by a woman who weaponized lies, and though the officers had walked away respecting her, the insult ran deeper than a false report. It was about dignity, about honor, and about a sacred family home nearly stolen by fraud. I drove into town with the binder I had been building for months, thick with documents, photographs, and sworn statements from neighbors. The county attorney's office was a squat brick building with no glamour, but when I dropped that binder on the desk, the sound carried weight. The attorney flipped through it, eyebrows climbing higher with every page. She called the police on a property owner in front of witnesses, claimed land that isn't under the HOA's jurisdiction. This isn't just harassment. This could be criminal fraud and abuse of authority. Within days, investigators began interviewing neighbors. One by one, people who had once been silent out of fear now found their voices. Mr. Lee, the retired teacher who lived 2 houses down, admitted Karen had fined him $500 for planting a cherry tree that supposedly violated sightline codes. A single mom confessed Karen had threatened to have her car towed for parking in her own driveway unless she paid $100 in administrative fees. Even the mail carrier shared stories of Karen intercepting letters she deemed non-compliant notices. The portrait forming wasn't of a community leader but of a dictator in suburban clothes. The real twist came when the county clerk produced deed records stretching back 50 years. The cabin and surrounding acreage had never once fallen under HOA boundaries. In fact, the HOA had no legal jurisdiction past a fence line a quarter mile from our porch. Karen's attempt to extend her reach wasn't just overzealous, it was illegal. She had falsified maps, redrawn boundary lines on pamphlets, and presented them at meetings as updated community documents. It was a house of cards, and now it was collapsing under its own weight. When the subpoena landed in her mailbox, witnesses say she went pale. At the next HOA meeting, she tried to bluster through it, waving the envelope like it was some minor clerical error. But whispers filled the room, neighbors leaning close to each other, no longer cowed by her voice. For the first time, people weren't nodding, they were questioning. And she could feel the tide turning against her. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the hearing. Karen sat at the defendant's table, her bulk squeezed into a tailored jacket, face pinched into a mask of disdain. My wife sat beside me, calm as ever, a pillar of quiet strength. The prosecutor wasted no time. Exhibit after exhibit was shown. Fake maps, fraudulent bylaws, falsified letters threatening liens that never existed. And then came the police report from the night she sicked the cops on my wife. Hearing her own words read aloud, "She's trespassing on HOA land. Arrest her," was damning enough. But when the officer testified about seeing my wife's military ID, about recognizing her service, and about Karen's immediate collapse into excuses, the room buzzed with outrage. Karen's attorney tried to paint her as misguided, as someone who only wanted to protect the community. But her greed was painted in neon colors across every document, every threat, every dollar siphoned from frightened neighbors. And then came the bombshell: the developer's emails. Investigators had found a string of messages between Karen and a real estate company, promising her a payout if she could clear the land around our cabin for future development. It was never about community. It was about profit. The verdict was swift: guilty on charges of fraud, harassment, falsification of documents, and filing false police reports. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with steel-gray hair, looked Karen dead in the eye and said, "You abused your neighbors. You abused the trust of this community. And you abused the law. This court will not tolerate tyrants hiding behind the word association." With that, she sentenced Karen to 5 years in state prison and ordered restitution to every neighbor she had defrauded. The gasp in the room was followed by something I'll never forget: applause. Not raucous, not mocking, but a steady rhythm of clapping hands from people who had once been too scared to even speak her name above a whisper. Karen's face drained of color as deputies placed cuffs on her wrists. She looked out over the crowd, perhaps expecting pity, perhaps hoping for a savior. But no one met her eyes. She left the courtroom to the sound of justice ringing in human hands. Life after Karen wasn't immediate bliss, but it was a kind of rebirth. The HOA collapsed, stripped of its fraudulent leadership. Neighbors formed a cooperative instead, one built on transparency and mutual respect. Rules weren't dictated, they were voted on. Money wasn't siphoned, it was accounted for in open books. And as for my wife and me, we were no longer the quiet targets of gossip and harassment. We were seen as part of the heart of the community, the couple who had stood up when others couldn't. Sometimes I catch sight of Karen's old house, now quiet, the blinds drawn. Rumor has it her family sold it to cover part of the restitution. Other times, I walk the trail behind the cabin and remember the night she tried to erase decades of history with one phone call. It almost worked. But then my wife's military ID, that small rectangle of authority and sacrifice, turned the tide. It was more than plastic and ink, it was the truth, undeniable and powerful, that stripped Karen of every lie. And so I ask you, if you were in my position watching your wife threatened on your own porch, watching your land claimed by someone with nothing but bluster, would you have fought as hard? Or would you have chosen peace at the cost of dignity? Was I right to take her down? Or should I have walked away? Share your thoughts, because these battles are never just about one neighbor. They're about what kind of communities we allow ourselves to live in.